mythology, there is a character who is very powerful. He would slay nations, and he was able to save and conquer people, and it was the great Thor, if you've ever heard of him or read a Marvel comic or watched a movie in the last decade. And Thor would have these amazing triumphs in battle. But Thor had a problem in his life, and that was he had an incredibly big ego. Some might say he was a prideful person. And so his dad said, Thor, I'm going to channel all of your energy out of you and put it into this hammer. And in this hammer will be what you use to continue to help people, the nations. But the trick is you will only be able to wield this hammer if you are worthy. And so he was cast to earth where he would have to learn to be worthy. And when he was being worthy, he could utilize the hammer. And when he wasn't worthy, it would be too heavy to pick up. And sometimes when we think of the idea of pride, we think of it like this. That if I'm worthy enough, and if I'm worthy of God, then I will be successful in my life doing what God wants me to do. But if I'm not worthy, well then, I got to figure that out. Now here's the interesting thing. Yes, if you are operating with a sense of an overinflated ego, you will not be worthy, and there will be things that happen to you where God will help reconcile your character. But the other is true. For those of you who think I'm just too unworthy, more specifically, for those of you who have ever thought I am unworthy of God's love, this message is for you too, because that is also a form of pride. You see, pride isn't just about having an overinflated ego. Pride is also about having an underinflated ego. More specifically, to quote C.S. Lewis, he said, pride is not about, or humility is not about thinking less of yourself. It's about thinking of yourself less. So on this journey of trying to become more humble, less prideful, today I'm going to give you 3 very specific things that you can do to become more humble. And let me show you those 3 specific things on the slide before. It would be practicing service, practicing curiosity, and practicing worship. Practicing service, practicing curiosity, and practicing worship. These 3 things will be like a roadmap or a path to discover more humility. Because young Scott, 10-year-old Scott, he had a pride and ego problem. He was very aware of it. In fact, his youth pastor told him this often, Scott, you're very prideful. And I said, I know I am quite fond of my own thoughts. In fact, I think I'm correct most of the time. It just doesn't help the fact that other people's opinions seem to fall short often. But I knew I had this pride problem. So I thought, okay, how do I correct this problem? And I tried to just will it into existence of, let me channel like inner humility, but it didn't quite work like that. And so I had to go on a journey of discovering how do I approach life with more of a humble attitude. And let me just say first, I have not arrived. I am not there yet, but I see the Bible and I see what it says. So I'm going to invite you into the journey with me. With that, we have been in a series in Proverbs talking about wisdom. So today's wisdom is how to be humble. And we are going to use the game of Jenga to help us explore this. Last week, Jason talked about our words and used Scrabble as an analogy. And so we're going to continue the game theme with our Jenga pieces. So let's talk about humility for a second. Here's what tends to happen. You're going through your life, everything is good, and you realize, hey, I have a unique talent. I have a brilliant mind. I could read things, and I have a photographic memory. I don't have a photographic memory, you might, but we recognize that we have skills. And then you might be like, hey, you know what? I am incredibly attractive. There's another skill set I have. You might feel like, hey, I'm very athletic. That's another skill set I have. You might recognize that you have gifts and strengths and talents, and you just keep puffing yourself up. And my definition of pride for us today is essentially when your view of yourself outpaces your character. So when you grow yourself and you grow your abilities and you harness your skills and you begin to let it sink into your head, oftentimes we outpace our character. And when we outpace our character, dastardly things happen. Now, the Bible warns us of this, and it tells us that dastardly things will happen. Let me give you a few examples. Proverbs 16:8. When pride comes, then comes disgrace. But with humility comes wisdom. Now, disgrace might sound like, okay, whatever, disgrace. But disgrace, when you actually think about it, to be from a place of grace, in God's grace, and then to be pulled out of that, that's pretty significant. Let me give you another one. Pride goes before destruction. a haughty spirit before the fall. You might be thinking, hey, I am really good at doing this life thing. I'm an excellent manager. Hey, I'm an incredible parent. I get my kid to bedtime on time and they sleep through the entire night. And look at those other parents. Their kid isn't sleeping through the night, but I'm getting my kid to sleep. And look at me go. And as you begin to outpace your character, you begin to make everyone else around you feel queasy because you know the tower is going to fall eventually. Another Bible verse I have for you to prove it. The Lord tears down the house of the proud. This one's curious because God's actually being active in it. It's not just, hey, as you build yourself up, you'll eventually fall down. But here's a verse where God is actively saying, as you increase your level of pride, it's not just that God watches you saying like, oh, good luck, which, I mean, if you want your life, like he'll do that. But it says God actively tears down. Now, when I first read these verses, I thought like, okay, there's a little hyperbole there. Maybe that's something the Bible does. But when you have example after example of the Bible literally saying, and God literally saying, people who are proud cause destruction, well, maybe there's something to be taken seriously with this concept of pride, where it's not just a cutesy little thing. In fact, C.S. Lewis said, pride is in the ground in which all sins grow. And at first I was like, okay, whatever. But the more I started thinking about that, sit on that with me for a second. Pride is in the ground in which all sins grow. So I started thinking about a junior hire who's just coming of age and they realize, hey, I am stronger than everyone else. And so you know what the junior hire does? He starts bullying others because this is what happens with pride. At first, it's about increasing your own ego. But then I start bullying others, and in my bullying of others, I start taking away from them. Or maybe you get a little older and you realize like, hey, I can go fast and I'm invincible. So let me drive with my e-bike down Irvine Boulevard without a helmet at 27 miles an hour. And you're like, ooh, that's scary, okay? Or maybe as you get a little older and you have a family and you have an addiction and you think, you know what, I can take care of this addiction myself, and you take it out on your kids and your family and you rob them while you continue to inflate your ego, not actually addressing the problems below. Or maybe you have a little more power and you're in charge of other people at work. And instead of using your position to help others and to raise them up, you use your position to make your profits better, to make your line items work, and you continue to make yourself taller and taller. And everyone in the room becomes more stressed because they can see how you are on a knife's edge of completely imploding, and yet, hey, you're living your life. Now, when I think of this idea, pride is in the ground in which all sins grow. Pride is in the ground in which I've seen wars come into place. Think of World War I. Think of World War II. Pride at the core. Pride is in the ground in which caused slavery. Think of how that came into existence, the dehumanization of people. Pride is in the ground in these forces that destroy people all over the world, leaning right back to the self. Pride is not just a silly little issue of having an overinflated ego. Pride is an issue that fundamentally destroys you, but it also destroys the people next to you who you love. It destroys the people who are around you as your neighbors, and it destroys the nations around you as you live a life that is unchecked. So when I see these verses in the Bible, it's like, oh my gosh, is this actually hyperbole? Is Proverbs 16:8, where it says pride goes before destruction, the haughty spirit before a fall? Is that actual hyperbole? No, I don't think it is. I think God is literally saying, when you do this to yourself and you let your ego go unchecked, or you let your ego get so small that you feel like you have no influence or power in the world, all of that relating to pride, God says this is a dangerous situation, and he will allow you to either topple over or he will actually cause it. Okay, it happened. Now for all of you, you can you can relax. It happened, it fell, okay. Pride goes before the fall. So what do we do? How do we avoid this situation? Because you've seen people who have been here. Unfortunately, some of you might be here yourself and you're like, my life is in shambles. What do? I tried to reach too high. How do we keep this from happening in our own lives? Because pride is one of the most destructive forces in the entire world. Well, Jesus gives us a roadmap, and I think it's pretty fantastic because 10-year-old Scott recognized that he had pride, but had no clue on how to deal with it. Like, I can try to be humble, but that just didn't work. I couldn't just force it in. So here's a roadmap that I think Jesus gives us, and I'm stealing a little bit of this from an author called Gene Edwards. He wrote a book called A Tale of Three Kings. And here he traces through three of the first kings of the nation of Israel, which would be Saul, King David, you might have heard of him, and David's son, Absalom. And here we get a little bit of a roadmap to how we can combat pride in our life, increase our humility, so we don't end up like this, but we end up a little more like Jesus. So here's the first thing. The first super practical step that Scott discovered through reading about King Saul was to have the courage to elevate others. Have the courage to elevate others. First of all, when I use the word courage, that in and of itself is quite a step. Because to be able to take that step, to move into a place where you're saying, I want to improve myself, I don't want to just live my life ignorant, but I want to increase my humility, that takes courage. So be confident of that. Be excited about the fact that, hey, if you're willing to take this step, that is something to be commendable, to have the courage in and of itself to face your demons and to be able to conquer them. So the courage to elevate others, here's what that looks like. Well, when looking at the life of Saul, who actually did this very poorly, we see in 1 Samuel 13, pride began to enter into his scenario. He committed a sin, and as a result, God said, I'm going to strip away your kingdom, and I'm going to give it to this David character. And so Saul became increasingly frustrated and angry at David as a result of this, to the point where we see pride beginning to distort Saul's output, where he even threw a javelin at David trying to kill him while David was just playing the harp. Imagine Brandon playing here, all of a sudden someone in the back, I want to be a worship leader. Yeah, okay, that's what happened. It was no good. Okay, so then pride began to destroy. Saul became so angry at David that he started chasing him all around the southern part of Israel to the point where it eventually led to Saul's death. Pride destroyed him at every level. He could have elevated David even after his mistake, but instead he chose to try to diminish David, and that began to break him down. Let me give you some Bible verse examples of this. Galatians 5:13, for you are called to freedom, brothers, only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. You can use your freedom for your own gain, and you can try to level yourself up, or you can use your freedom to serve someone else, to help them take the pieces that have been broken down and to help them assemble their life. 1 Peter 4:10, as each has received a gift, use it to serve one another as good stewards of God's various grace. Use your gifts to serve one another. What will happen even as we gain humility? We'll still have moments where pride kicks in and pride begins to take over. But if we stop focusing on ourselves and the rise to the top, and we start focusing on how we can support others, God begins to work. Here's an example, Philippians 2:3-4. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to your own interests, but also to the interest of others. Right, that's the pattern. That's the mindset. That's counter to what culture would tell you to do. Culture says, hey, get to the top, however you need to do it. Thrive, conquer. But the biblical model is to say, hey, focus on building someone else. Here's what's interesting, a quote that I have for you. There was a guy who did business consulting, and he wrote a book called Good to Great. He tracked through some of the most successful Fortune 500 company leaders, and he said, what are the most core traits that are consistent across these high-octane leaders? And he found this. He said, leadership is marked by two characteristics: steely determination, I love that phrase, steely determination, and an attitude of humility. Steely determination and an attitude of humility. He wasn't a Jesus person. He is in the business world saying, hey, this concept of humility is at its core. And in fact, if you want to be successful in business, humility has to be a key part of it. Here's what happens, I think, when we start focusing on others and the development of others. There's a principle that Pastor Jason talked about a couple weeks ago. It's that you reap what you sow. And to put it in another way, what you make happen for others, God will make happen for you. So as you focus on building others up, what God does is he goes into his magic bag and he then pulls out pieces you didn't even know were there and begins to fill in your character. And so as you begin making things happen for others, God makes happen for you, and he begins filling in the pieces where your character can now support the growth that is happening in your life. That's incredible. You reap what you sow. What you make happen for others, God makes happen for you. And so the first step to becoming more humble, less prideful, is to actually just focus on yourself a little less. How can you make something happen for others? And we do this through service. We do this through serving others, through taking care of one another. What would it look like for you and your family to go that extra mile, and even though when you're tired and you're worn out, to give that one extra step to your spouse, to hold the baby who's crying at 3 o'clock in the morning again? What would it look like for you to take the extra step in your business to care for your employees, to really go after, to support them and love them? What would it look like for you to look after the needs of others? There's a person in our congregation. Her name is Shirley. You guys all know her. Shirley came to us 2 years ago now saying, hey, I have been a teacher. I have helped create flower bouquets for weddings here. I have been at St. Andrews for longer than you've been alive, Scott, but I'm here to serve. Where do you need help? And we said, well, okay. So we talked to Chase, and Chase said, actually, we need someone to help greet the kids as they come in. So would you be willing to do that? And she said, no, that's absolutely beneath me. I don't want to do it. No, she didn't. She said, of course. Of course, I will serve. How do you need it? And she started greeting students every week when they would come in. Hi, I'm Shirley. You can check in. Hi, I'm Shirley. You can check in. And the first couple weeks, no one really talked to her because no one knew who she was. But the more that she stood there with a smile and a warm face, you could see their hearts begin to open up. Then she said, okay, Chase, what is there anything else I could do? And Chase said, hey, a handful of students are going to camp. Would you be willing to write letters for them going to camp, just encouraging them? She said, okay, great. Let me get my small group. So you guys who went to camp, you know, that was from Shirley and her friends. Now, I know some of you guys don't know how to read cursive, and so if you write a letter for a student in the future, don't write in cursive. But it was the thought that counts. They were serving. They were getting into it, saying, not what I can do, or not with strings attached, saying, hey, I will serve, but I need you to do it my way, or I want you to make my business happen, or I want you to make my ministry thing happen. They just said, hey, Chase, Jaylene, you guys are in charge of the next age of kids who desperately need Jesus. Where is God moving, and how can I be part of that? What would it look like for you to serve others? Now, I know that when you start serving, God will start filling in your pieces. But as you start serving, what you will see is other people being raised up in a way that'll transform them. How do you combat pride? Elevate others, and you can elevate them by serving. Let's jump to the next. The way that we combat pride is in elevating others through serving, and it is in having the courage to grow. Have the courage to grow. This one's really hard because when it comes to growing is incredibly painful. Because in order to grow, I have to be willing to recognize that there is something out there that I don't know. There is something I have to learn. But there's so much beauty in that. I think David models this incredibly well as he became king. Here's an example. In 1 Samuel 18:24, we see that David waited a long time. He was anointed to be king when he was a wee little lad, and then he had to wait years and years and years. Then, as he became king, he was like, great, I'm going to do something that's going to help unite the people together, and I'm going to unintentionally weaponize the Ark of the Covenant, which represented God's presence, for my political gain. And God said, absolutely not. I will not be weaponized for political gain. And God cut him down. And David was like, God, why would you do this? God said, because pride comes before the fall. David repented. You see later, David make another huge mistake. He had some guy killed so that David could have his wife. And then when Nathan the prophet was like, bro, what did you do? David was like, oh, okay, I messed up. It's a gross summary, so maybe read 1 and 2 Samuel. There's a lot of good in there. But you get the idea that David had a heart that said, okay, God, hey, I messed up. I realize that there are times when I got here. And David was punished. David was punished. Things happened to him. But we also see that in that process, God restacked his character. Now, here's what's interesting about that in terms of having the courage to grow. It's a hugely biblical concept. Here's a handful of verses to help you see that in action. Proverbs 1:5. Let the wise listen and add to their learning, and let the discerning get guidance. You want to be wise? Listen. You know the old adage, you have 2 ears, 1 mouth. Listen as twice as much as you speak. I hate that, but it's true. Here's another thing that it says. The heart of the discerning acquires knowledge, for the ears of the wise seek it out. The ears of the wise seek it out. It's one thing to be willing to listen to critique. It's another thing to actively pursue it, to go to your spouse and say, hey, how could I be doing a better job? That's a tough conversation. Or to go to your employees and say, hey, what would it look like to be a better manager for you? Or to go to your church and say, hey, how could I serve whatever needs you have, no matter how low the position might seem? The heart of the discerning acquires knowledge, for the ears of the wise seek it out. Let's continue. 1 Corinthians 8:2. Those who think they know something do not yet know as they ought to know. Now that's curious, because if you feel like you know everything, there's a rude awakening for you, because you don't. There's a clinical psychologist and therapist. He said this when it comes to knowing everything. Jordan Peterson, the one before. He said, it's better to make friends with that which you don't know than to insist on your friendship with that which you know. If you're already in the promised land, then it's obvious what you currently know is insufficient. I thought that's hilarious, because yes, so many of us go around thinking like, hey, I know what's going on. But if you resolve yourself to learn, to see that there is genius in someone else, there's a divine spark in you because you were created in the image of God. And so if I walk through life with a resolve to see your brilliance in action, well, I'm going to come to you with an open posture. There's a famous soccer coach who quoted Walt Whitman, and he said, be curious, not judgmental. Be curious, not judgmental. Imagine if you were to walk around recognizing that in order for me to understand God a little more, I had to rub shoulders with you. And in order for me to understand just a different aspect of God, I had to have a conversation with you. Then instead of me trying to prove my knowledge to you, I would be walking out there like this, recognizing that there is dignity and value and there is something that you have to offer that I need. Now here's what happens. When you begin to have that mentality, what happens in our ecosystem is it's almost like building a platform, whether God begins to build that platform, as you have a mentality of curiosity to explore one another. You build a foundation that not just helps you, but it helps those around you. And so it raises you up, but it also raises the person up next to you. See how that works? Because if I'm going to you saying there is value, there is genius to be had, there is something on you waiting to be unlocked, and I need that from you. I need to learn. I need to grow from you. You are essentially raising them up, raising the bar. And instead of you focusing on yourself, just like a rising tide floats all boats, you begin to elevate those around you. Don't you like the people who, when you're around them, all of a sudden you leave, you're like, I feel like a better person. I'm more joyful. I'm just elated. And you realize that when you're just around that person's aura, you become better. That's this. And that's in those people, if you look at what's core in them, they're curious. They bring out the best in you. They elevate you. I was thinking about someone who does this for me. And I'm reminded of a woman who came to me when her mom was going through her fight with cancer. And she said, Scott, how can I help you out? I see all you're going through. What do you need? And I said, actually, we're so short in volunteers. I was supposed to be helping with kids this week. Would you mind filling in? And Heather said, absolutely. Heather's a high-octane person. She's a businesswoman, leads things, like in charge. She is up here. So when we asked her, hey, would you help wrangle kids for an hour? That's a job that's beneath her by definition when you look at her resume. But she said, absolutely. And so she went in there, wrangled kids. She asked questions on, hey, how do you guys want to do this? How can I be supportive? How can I help? And it was that attitude and posture that helped raise the program of our kids ministry to the point where now she's teaching on Sunday mornings at 9 o'clock so that she can continue to impart wisdom and knowledge to them. This is a woman who is willing to say, hey, how could I serve you? And then ultimately, Scott, how could I be there for you? How could I support you? How can I be curious, not judgmental, knowing that you're going through something that I don't quite, that actually she does understand, but I'm going through something, but how could she be there to support? What would it look like for you to do that for other people? What would it look like for you to be curious, to learn, to grow, To not just walk into your work or your home or even your ministry thinking you have all the answers, but walk in to say, hey, whoever's in charge here, God has placed you in charge for such a time as this. How can I be part of what God is doing through you? What happens when you're curious like that is that you will not only raise yourself, but you will raise those around you. So first, have the courage to serve one another, to care for them. Secondly, have the courage to be curious. And lastly, have the courage to honor. As you honor one another, as you walk around, this is a key biblical principle that is inherently tied to worship. But our worship to God is twofold, because we honor others and we honor God as a form of worshiping God. Let me explain through Absalom. Absalom was David's son, and Absalom did this poorly. There was a family dynamic that happened, or a family situation that happened. Absalom was ticked at how his dad handled it, and so it began to fester in his heart. And instead of honoring David, it began to tear him apart. So for 10 years, this festered in Absalom's heart to the point where in chapter 15, he then decided, I'm going to raise up a coup, and I'm going to take over the kingdom. And he was successful. He actually did it. He was able to raise himself up, and the pride caused him to be unstable and ultimately led to his death, where pride completely consumed him. That's what happens when we don't honor, when we let pride dictate our life. We see David had a different posture in that, where he continued to ask forgiveness and honor. Now here's some biblical principles that support that idea. We see in honoring others, whoever pursues righteousness as opposed to getting even, and love finds prosperity and honor. In Romans 12:10, it says, be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another above yourselves. As you honor one another above yourselves, that is an act of worship, because here's what God asks us to do. He says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And then Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. He continues that on. The process of honor is worship, and you worship God, and as you worship God, that centers you, because it helps remind you, I am not the captain, Jesus is the captain. But it also is a process of honoring others, and that is a form of worship to God. To see the divine spark in the person next to you and recognize that God created that person and is worthy of dignity and respect. There's an author. He was a sergeant in the Marine Corps, as well as a theologian afterwards. Incredibly smart guy. His name's Brennan Manning. He also in his life struggled with alcoholism and depression, even after becoming a Jesus follower. And he wrote this book called Ragamuffin Gospel, and it has this brilliant image of a kid going before a baker, emptying out his pockets, saying, I need food, but I don't have anything to offer. And so I'm going to modernize the image that he had for our context here to help kind of close all this up, to help make it make sense. Imagine you wanted to be part of building this church, this grand church. And so you went to God and you said, I want to help be part of that, but I have nothing to offer. So God said, great, I'm going to give you a talent, and I want you to bring this to the carpenter. And when you bring it to the carpenter saying you're here to help, you want to be part of what God is doing. So perfect. The person goes and says, all right, Mr. Carpenter, I want to help. Here's my piece of wood to contribute to the building. The carpenter says, great, thank you so much. We'll put that right here. I want you to come over and let me show you how to hold a hammer and nail. Next person comes along and says, God, I want to be part of building that church too. And so God says, okay, great. Here are some pieces of wood for you. I want you to take that to the carpenter and give it to him. And so, okay, I'm going to walk over. Carpenter, here's what I have to offer you. And the carpenter says, great, put that here. And I want you to help me learn how to hammer and nail. And then the first person is like, wait a second. How come they had 3 pieces of wood and God only gave me 1 piece of wood? And then they start getting upset and a little squabbling about each other, and I only have 3 and you have 1. And then the next person comes around and says, God, I want to help build the church too. And God says, here's your piece of wood. And he's like, okay, great. It's okay, Mr. Carpenter. And he's all excited. Here I am with my piece of wood. And Jesus says, okay, great. Put that there. Let me show you how to hammer a nail. And then he's like, wait a minute. Why is mine so small and you have 3 pieces? And as I illustrate this image, you can imagine in the grand scheme of a building this size, a piece of wood this small has but little significance. But in the hands of God, it has the most significance, because you might try to continue to stack yourself up and make yourself important. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how high you are. What matters is what you do in the hands of God. Because more specifically, what God actually invites you to do is to take what's in your hand and to give it to other people, to help them fill in the blocks and to give away of yourself. This is the model that Jesus offers. And you might say, hey, I'm getting shorter and shorter to the point where it might feel like you have very little to give. But here's what God does when you do that. God says, hey, what you don't recognize is that I can give you another platform. I can raise you up despite whatever you think you have. In fact, I invented the platform. I could hold you up here if I wanted. I could put you on top of the roof if I wanted, because I created it all anyways. So instead of getting caught up in how do we make our abilities high and outpacing our character, get focused on what you could do for God, because as you honor and as you give of yourself, that's the process of literally becoming more like Jesus, where you are taking care of someone else's needs, where you are being the hands and feet of Jesus for them. That's the invitation. And no matter if it's in your family or in your business or here at church even, as you give of yourself, what God says is, watch what I could do in the hands of someone who is willing to give it all away. Because those are the people that God uses. Those are the people that God says, hey, we're going to go over here and we're going to work on a special project because you're willing to have a heart that's moldable by me. When I think of someone who I see do this, there's a couple. They're here every week. High-capacity couple. She came to us and said, hey, how can we help? And we said, well, actually, we need some help checking kids in because we have more kids coming than we have the capacity to check them in, so we need someone to help us with that. So she said, great, I can help check in. She is a highly competent woman. Her name is Giannina. I'm sure you know her. And she was willing to say, yes, I will type on an iPad to help check kids in because that's the need the church has. Her husband started seeing her get involved every week. He is a firefighter, high-capacity dude. And he said, where do you need help? We said, well, actually, there's parents who come in these family rooms every week, and just getting to church is often the most in terms of their act of worship. And he said, great, I can help walk through, take their orders, and get them a cup of coffee every Sunday morning. And so that's what he does. Are those jobs beneath them? If you were to look at a resume, absolutely they're beneath them. But because they're doing it for Jesus, there's a recognition that nothing is beneath me when it's to God I'm offering the gift to. And the more that we do that and give of ourselves and strip our pride down, the more that we work on serving others, seeing their genius, honoring one another, well, that puts in a posture where God begins to unlock and unfold us. So here's the invitation today. Recognize that pride will kill and destroy. Pride will fundamentally break you down. And the second you think you've mastered pride, the enemy's done his job, because there it lies again, it's there. And so you can combat that by having the courage. Having the courage to serve one another. Having the courage to be curious about where you can learn and grow. And having the courage to honor through worship, because those are the steps, the path to humility. And as you put those into practice, I think what you'll find is you'll be looking a whole lot more like Jesus and thriving. Let's pray. God, as we've talked today, may your word ring in our hearts and remind us of the things that you will have us hold on to for us to continue to become more like you and to be shaped like you and to be transformed by you. God, we thank you for people in our life who have demonstrated aspects of humility for us to hold on to and celebrate and honor. God, help us be more like those people in our life that we love to be around. Lord, make us curious. Lord, help us be servants and seeing the needs of others. And Lord, may we honor you in our actions both here and around. May we honor the people that we love and we care about. Lord, help us become more humble. Help us to become more like you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.